This photo of two friends initially seemed harmless until historians uncovered a disturbing secret. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., routinely received donations, boxes filled with family photographs, documents, and artifacts that people hoped would contribute to the preservation of Black history. James Rivera, a curator at the museum for 5 years, had examined countless images, daguerreotypes of freedmen, portraits of civil rights activists, and snapshots of everyday life across generations. But on a muggy September morning in 2024, he opened a box that made him pause in shock. The donation had originated from an estate sale in Richmond, Virginia. An accompanying letter explained that the items had belonged to an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, who had died at the age of 97, leaving no living relatives. Her home had been packed with historical documents and photographs, meticulously preserved but never explained. The estate executor believed the museum might find something valuable within the collection. James carefully lifted out a leather portfolio and opened it. Inside, nestled between layers of tissue paper, was a studio photograph mounted on thick cardboard. The photographers Mark Red Anderson and Sons Photography, Richmond, Virginia, 1889. Two young men stood side by side in the photograph, both dressed in identical dark suits with high-collared white shirts and patterned ties. They were posed in front of a painted backdrop depicting a library with books lining the walls. A small table beside them held a vase of flowers and what appeared to be a Bible. The young man on the left was white, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, with neatly parted light hair and a developing handlebar mustache. His expression was serious yet friendly, his eyes looking directly at the camera with confidence. The young man on the right was black, roughly the same age, with a strong jawline and intelligent eyes. His posture was equally upright, and his clothing matched his companions in quality and style. Most striking was their positioning. The white man's hand rested on the black man's shoulder, and the black man's hand reached across to grip his companion's forearm. It was an unmistakable gesture of friendship, of brotherhood. Even for a photograph taken in 1889 Virginia, just 24 years after the end of the Civil War, a period when Jim Crow laws were solidifying racial segregation throughout the South, this image was extraordinary. Interracial friendships certainly existed, but they were rarely documented so formally, so publicly. Studio portraits were expensive, carefully planned events. People didn't commission them casually. James picked up his magnifying glass and examined the photograph more closely. That's when he began to notice details that contradicted the simple narrative of friendship. The white man's hand on his companion's shoulder. James looked closer and saw that the fingers weren't resting gently, but gripping tightly, the knuckles slightly white from the pressure. The black man's smile, which had seemed genuine at first glance, didn't quite reach his eyes. In his free hand, the one not gripping his friend's arm, was clenched into a fist at his side. James moved his magnifying glass across the background of the photograph. The painted backdrop depicted a refined library, but in the lower right corner, partially obscured by the small table, something hung on the wall. He adjusted his desk lamp and leaned closer. It was a chain, heavy links painted into the backdrop, incongruous with the elegant library setting. Why would a photography studio include a chain in a backdrop meant to suggest education and refinement? James turned the photograph over. The back of the mounting board was yellowed with age, but someone had written across it in faded brown ink. The handwriting was shaky, as if written quickly or under emotional distress. Thomas and Marcus. The last photograph before the departure. May God forgive us for what we have done. September 14th, 1889. James read the inscription 3 times. Last photograph before the departure. Were they going somewhere together or separating? And that phrase, may God forgive us for what we have done. Not what we must do, or what we will do, but what we have done. Something had already happened when this photograph was taken, something that required divine forgiveness. He photographed the image from multiple angles, capturing every detail in high resolution. Then he opened his laptop and began to search. He needed to find out who Thomas and Marcus were, why they had posed for this photograph together in 1889 Virginia, and what dark secret was hidden in the tension beneath their posed friendship. The investigation had begun, and James sensed that this photograph would reveal a story far more complex and painful than the simple portrait of friendship it initially appeared to be. James spent the rest of that day searching for any record of Thomas and Marcus from 1889 Richmond. Without last names, the search proved difficult. Both names were common during that period. He started with the photographers Mark, Anderson, and Sons Photography. Richmond city directories from the 1880s indicated that Anderson and Sons had operated a studio on Broad Street from 1885 to 1893, advertising themselves as specialists in fine portraiture for distinguished families. The emphasis on distinguished families suggested they catered to Richmond's white elite, making the photograph of an interracial pair even more unusual. James examined the photograph again under different lighting, searching for any other clues he might have missed. The suits both men wore were expensive, tailored, not off the rack. The fabric appeared to be fine wool, appropriate for a formal portrait. Their shoes, visible at the bottom of the frame, were polished leather. Everything about their presentation suggested wealth and status. But something about the black man's posture bothered James. Despite the expensive clothing and the confident stance, there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a guardedness in his expression that hinted at someone who had learned to be careful, to watch and wait. James had seen similar expressions in photographs of freedmen from the Reconstruction era, people who had gained legal freedom but still navigated a world designed to restrict them. He decided to alter his search strategy. If these were distinguished families, there might be records in Richmond's historical archives, property records, court documents, newspaper mentions. He contacted his colleague, Dr. Patricia Okoye, who taught African American history at Howard University and had extensive connections with archives throughout Virginia. Patricia called him back within 2 hours. "I'm intrigued," she said. "Can you send me high-resolution scans of the photograph? I want to take a look myself." James emailed her the images, and they arranged to meet the following day at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, where Patricia had already scheduled time to search through property records and newspaper archives from the 1880s and 1890s. That evening, James couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. He had handled thousands of historical images, but something about this one felt different. The inscription, "May God forgive us," suggested guilt, complicity, perhaps even a crime. Then there was the chain in the background, partially hidden but unmistakably there. Had the photographer included it deliberately, or was it part of the studio's standard backdrop, a detail that only took on a sinister meaning in the context of who was being photographed? He pulled up census records from 1890, searching for any Thomas and Marcus listed in the same household in Richmond or the surrounding counties. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed by fire, but fragments remained. After 2 hours of searching, he found an entry that made his pulse quicken. In Henrico County, just outside Richmond, the 1880 census listed a Thomas Whitmore, aged 13, living with his parents, William and Elizabeth Whitmore. William's occupation was listed as planter, the term used for large-scale farmers, often former plantation owners. The household included several people listed as servants, and among them was a boy named Marcus, age 13, with no last name given. His race was marked as colored. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. In 1880, 15 years after the end of slavery, census records still often listed black workers without full names or with only first names, a holdover from the era of slavery, when enslaved people had no legal surnames. If this was the same Marcus from the photograph, he would have been around 22 or 23 in 1889, matching the apparent age of the man in the portrait. And Thomas Whitmore would have been the same age, having grown up in the same household as Marcus. James searched for more information about the Whitmore family. William Whitmore appeared in multiple records, property deeds, tax records, mentions in Richmond newspapers related to agricultural associations. The family had owned a substantial plantation called Oakwood, about 15 miles outside Richmond, before the war. After the war, they had retained the property, though the records indicated it had been reduced in size. What had happened to Marcus? Had he remained with the Whitmore family after emancipation, and if so, under what circumstances? The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in 1865, but James knew that many formerly enslaved people had remained with their former owners, bound by economic necessity, exploitative labor contracts, or outright intimidation. He needed to see the property records, labor contracts, and any legal documents related to the Whitmore family. He needed to understand the relationship between Thomas and Marcus, whether they had genuinely been friends, as the photograph suggested, or whether something darker lay beneath the surface of their posed companionship. James looked at the photograph one more time before closing his laptop. Two young men dressed identically, hands on each other in gestures of connection. But the tension in Marcus's fist, the too tight grip of Thomas's hand, the chain in the background, all of it whispered a story that was far from simple friendship. Tomorrow in Richmond, he would begin to uncover the truth. The Library of Virginia occupied a modern building near Capitol Square in Richmond, its collections preserving centuries of the state's history, including the uncomfortable truths of slavery, Jim Crow, and racial violence. James met Patricia in the research room early Wednesday morning, and they requested records for Henrico County from 1860 through 1900, focusing on property deeds, court documents, and labor contracts. The archivist brought them boxes of documents, and they divided the work. Patricia took the property records, while James focused on court files and legal contracts. Within an hour, Patricia had located the Whitmore family's property history. The plantation was called Oakwood, she said, spreading out a surveyor's map from 1858. 1,200 acres. William Whitmore inherited it from his father in 1867, right after the war. The 1860 slave schedule shows the family owned 43 enslaved people. James felt the familiar weight that came with reading such documents, each number representing a human life, a stolen identity, generations of trauma. Do we have names? The slave schedules only list ages and gender, not names. But look at this. Patricia pulled out another document. This is the 1870 census, the first one after emancipation. William Whitmore is still at Oakwood, but now he has employees instead of enslaved people. And here, she pointed to a line. Marcus Freeman, age 16, labor. Freeman. Marcus had taken a surname after emancipation, claiming his freedom through his name. But he had remained at Oakwood, working for the family that had once owned him. James searched through the court records and found what he was looking for: labor contracts filed with Henrico County between 1866 and 1885. He pulled out the file for 1866 and began reading. The contracts were supposedly voluntary agreements between freedmen and their former owners, establishing terms of employment after slavery ended. But as James read through them, he saw how easily such contracts could become tools of continued bondage. The terms were exploitative. Workers agreed to year-long contracts with minimal wages, often paid in scrip that could only be used at the plantation store. If they left before the contract ended, they could be arrested for breach of contract and forced to return. Any debts to the employer for housing, food, clothing were deducted from wages, ensuring workers remained perpetually indebted. He found Marcus's contract, dated January 1866. Marcus Freeman, approximately 14 years old, agrees to work for William Whitmore for 1 year in exchange for room, board, and $5 per month. The contract stated that Marcus owed William Whitmore $20 for care and sustenance provided during the transition from slavery to freedom. At $5 per month, it would take Marcus 4 months just to pay off that manufactured debt. James flipped through the years. 1867, another contract, similar terms. 1868, same. 1869, 1870, 1871, year after year, Marcus Freeman signed contracts binding him to the Whitmore plantation. Or perhaps signed. Wasn't accurate. Many of the contracts bore only an X next to Marcus's name, suggesting he couldn't write or had been prevented from learning. This is peonage, Patricia said quietly, reading over his shoulder. Legal slavery under a different name. James nodded grimly. Peonage, the practice of binding workers through debt, had been officially outlawed by Congress in 1867, but the law was rarely enforced in the South. Thousands of black workers remained trapped in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, bound by contracts, debt, and the threat of violence. But the contract stopped in 1885. After that year, James found no record of Marcus Freeman signing any labor agreement with William Whitmore. Had Marcus finally escaped, or had something else happened? He pulled out newspaper archives from the Richmond Dispatch, searching for any mention of the Whitmore family or Oakwood plantation. Patricia searched the Henrico County court records for any legal proceedings involving the family. It was Patricia who found the first clue. James, look at this. It's a civil case filed in September 1889. William Whitmore versus Thomas Whitmore, a property dispute. James moved to her side. The case file was thin, just a few pages, but the header indicated it had been filed on September 10, 1889, 4 days before the photograph was taken. The complaint was written in the formal legal language of the period, but its meaning was clear. William Whitmore was accusing his son, Thomas, of attempting to steal property that rightfully belonged to the family estate. The specific property wasn't detailed in the filing, only described as human chattel unlawfully retained. A human chattel? James said softly. In 1889, 24 years after the 13th Amendment, Patricia pointed to another line. And look at this. Thomas filed a counterclaim the same day. He accused his father of maintaining illegal peonage contracts and claimed he had evidence of fraud and coercion. James felt pieces clicking into place. Thomas Whitmore had discovered what his father was doing. He had found evidence that Marcus Freeman and possibly others were being held in illegal bondage through fraudulent contracts and debt manipulation. And Thomas had decided to act, to testify against his own father. That would explain the inscription on the photograph. May God forgive us for what we have done. Thomas had betrayed his father. He had chosen his friend over his family, justice over loyalty. But what had happened next? The case file showed the initial complaint and counterclaim, but nothing more. No trial date, no resolution, no verdict. James searched the newspaper archives for September and October 1889, looking for any mention of the Whitmore case. He found nothing. No trial announcements, no reports of testimony, no scandal. For a prominent family like the Whitmores, the absence of coverage was suspicious. Then Patricia found something in the November 1889 papers, a brief obituary tucked away on an inside page. Thomas William Whitmore, aged 23, died suddenly on October 2, 1889, at his family home in Henrico County. He is survived by his father, William Whitmore, and mother, Elizabeth Whitmore. Services will be private. The family requests no visitors. James read it twice. Thomas had died less than 3 weeks after the photograph was taken, less than a month after filing his counterclaim against his father. The timing was too convenient to be a coincidence. We need to find out how he died, James said. And we need to find out what happened to Marcus. James and Patricia requested death certificates for Henrico County from October 1889. The clerk brought them a ledger book, its pages brittle and yellowed. James found Thomas Whitmore's entry, dated October 2, 1889. The cause of death was listed as accidental shooting. The attending physician was Dr. Samuel Harrison. The informant who reported the death was William Whitmore, father of the deceased. Accidental shooting, Patricia said skeptically, 3 weeks after he accused his father of illegal peonage? James photographed the page. We need to find the coroner's report, if there is one, and any newspaper coverage of the death. They returned to the newspaper archives, this time searching specifically for Thomas Whitmore's death. In the October 4, 1889 edition of the Richmond Dispatch, they found a longer article, Tragedy at Oakwood Plantation. Young Thomas Whitmore, son of respected planter William Whitmore, died Tuesday evening in what authorities are calling an unfortunate hunting accident. According to Sheriff Martin Crawford, young Whitmore was cleaning a rifle when it discharged, striking him in the chest. He died within minutes. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the family physician, confirmed the death as accidental. The family is said to be devastated by the loss of their only son. The article continued with praise for the Whitmore family's standing in the community, William's service on various boards, and expressions of sympathy from neighbors. There was no mention of the pending legal case between father and son. "This is a cover-up," Patricia said flatly. "A prominent family loses their son in a hunting accident just as he's about to expose his father in court. The sheriff calls it accidental before any investigation. The family physician signs off on it, and somehow the newspapers never mention the legal dispute." James agreed, but proving it more than a century later would be difficult. They needed to find people who had witnessed what happened, servants, workers, neighbors who might have written letters or kept diaries. And they needed to find Marcus Freeman. He had been at the center of Thomas's accusations. He must have known the truth about what happened at Oakwood. If Marcus had survived, if he had left any record, it might hold the answers they needed. James searched for Marcus Freeman in records after 1889. The 1890 census was destroyed, but the 1900 census might show where Marcus had ended up. He pulled up the digital archives and began searching Virginia, then expanding to neighboring states. He found nothing. No Marcus Freeman of the right age anywhere in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, or West Virginia in the 1900 census. It was as if Marcus had vanished after that photograph was taken. Could he have died too? Patricia asked. Maybe William Whitmore killed both of them. Or maybe Marcus escaped, James said. If Thomas was trying to free him, maybe he succeeded before he died. Maybe Marcus ran and changed his name to avoid being tracked. Patricia pulled out her phone. "I'm going to contact the African American Genealogy Network. They specialize in tracing families through the post-emancipation period when records get spotty. If Marcus survived and had descendants, they might be able to find them." While Patricia made calls, James continued searching through Henrico County records. He found property transfers for Oakwood Plantation. William Whitmore had sold portions of the land in 1891 and 1893, suggesting possible financial difficulties. He found tax records, business licenses, and mundane legal filings, but nothing about the case between father and son, nothing about what had really happened in September and October of 1889. Then he found something unexpected, a probate record from 1912. William Whitmore had died at age 78, and his estate was being settled. The probate included an inventory of property, debts, and assets. Among the debts listed was a curious entry: outstanding legal settlement, Freeman matter, $500. James stared at the entry. 23 years after Thomas's death, William Whitmore's estate still acknowledged an unresolved legal matter involving someone named Freeman. $500 in 1912 was a substantial sum, roughly equivalent to $15,000 in 2024. What was this settlement for? He searched for any related documents but found nothing. The Freeman matter remained unexplained, a cryptic reference in an old man's probate file. Patricia returned with news. "I spoke with Dr. Raymond Cole at the Freedmen's Bureau Project. He's going to search their database for any Marcus Freeman who might have relocated after 1889. They have records from black churches, mutual aid societies, and freedmen schools that sometimes fill in gaps when census data is missing." James showed her the probate entry. "Look at this. William Whitmore owed money related to a Freeman matter when he died in 1912. A settlement," Patricia said thoughtfully. "Maybe Thomas did free Marcus before he died. Maybe William had to pay Marcus as part of settling the legal case, pay him back wages, compensate him for years of illegal peonage." But why would that still be outstanding in 1912? James asked. Maybe Marcus was never found to receive the payment. Or maybe William fought it in court for years, and it wasn't resolved until after his death. James felt they were circling something important, a truth buried under layers of legal maneuvering and family secrets. The photograph showed Thomas and Marcus together, two young men whose lives had been intertwined since childhood. Thomas had tried to free his friend from his own father's exploitation, but something had gone terribly wrong. They needed to find Marcus Freeman's story, where he had gone after 1889, whether he had ever received justice, whether he had survived to tell his version of what happened at Oakwood Plantation. 3 days later, Dr. Raymond Cole called James with the first break in Marcus Freeman's trail. "I found him," Raymond said, excitement evident in his voice. "Or, at least, I found someone who matches the profile." In 1891, a man named Marcus Freeman joined the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. The membership roll lists him as 24 years old, originally from Virginia, employed as a carpenter. "Philadelphia," James repeated, already pulling up his laptop. "That's a long way from Richmond." "That's what makes me think it's him," Raymond said. A lot of freedmen headed north to escape the South, especially if they were running from dangerous situations. Philadelphia had a strong Black community, good employment opportunities, and most importantly, it was far enough from Virginia that a former enslaved person could start fresh. Raymond sent James digital copies of the church records. The entry for Marcus Freeman was brief: admitted to membership on April 12, 1891, by profession of faith. The handwriting was neat, the record routine, but it meant Marcus had survived whatever happened at Oakwood. He had escaped, traveled hundreds of miles north, and begun rebuilding his life. James searched Philadelphia city directories from the 1890s. In the 1892 directory, he found Marcus Freeman listed as a carpenter, residing at 712 South Street in the heart of Philadelphia's Black neighborhood. By 1895, the same Marcus Freeman was listed as owning a small carpentry business on Lombard Street. "He made it," James said to Patricia when he called her with the news. "Marcus got out and built a life for himself." "That's remarkable," Patricia said, "but I want to know how he escaped and what he knew about Thomas Whitmore's death." James continued his search through Philadelphia records. In 1896, Marcus Freeman married a woman named Sarah Johnson at First Baptist Church. The marriage record listed Marcus as 30 years old, born in Virginia, both parents deceased. It was common for formerly enslaved people to list their parents as deceased, even if they didn't know their fate. Slavery had broken so many families were torn apart, and reunification was often an impossible dream. The 1900 census revealed that Marcus and Sarah Freeman were residing on South Street with their 2 young children. Marcus was listed as a carpenter and contractor, a clear indication of his success in transitioning from wage labor to business ownership in less than a decade. However, the most significant discovery occurred when James delved into the Philadelphia newspaper archives. In the October 15, 1899 edition of the Philadelphia Tribune, a prominent Black newspaper, he stumbled upon an article that sent shivers down his spine. Local businessman shares story of escape from peonage. The article began, "Mr. Marcus Freeman, a respected carpenter and pillar of our community, delivered a powerful speech on Thursday evening at the Mother Bethel AME Church, recounting his harrowing experiences under illegal peonage in Virginia following the Civil War." Mr. Freeman's testimony served as a stark reminder that the struggle for genuine freedom persists, even decades after emancipation. James read the article not once, not twice, but 3 times, absorbing every word. Marcus had bravely shared his story publicly, standing before a church congregation and laying bare the events that transpired at Oakwood Plantation. While the article didn't delve into the specifics of his testimony, it summarized that Marcus had vividly described years of forced labor, deceitful contracts, and the brutal violence employed to prevent workers from leaving. It specifically mentioned a friend, Thomas Whitmore, who had paid the ultimate price for his unwavering conscience. James continued his search, scouring Philadelphia newspapers for any further mentions of Marcus Freeman, and he found several more articles. Marcus had become a vocal advocate for labor rights, tirelessly speaking at churches and community gatherings, shedding light on the ongoing exploitation of Black workers in the South. In 1902, Marcus courageously testified before a congressional committee that was investigating peonage and convict leasing systems. James located the congressional testimony within the Library of Congress archives. Marcus Freeman's testimony, delivered on March 6, 1902, spanned an extensive 15 pages. As James began to read, a story of immense heartbreak and outrage unfolded before his eyes. Marcus testified that he had been born into slavery at Oakwood Plantation around the year 1866. Following emancipation, when he was approximately 14 years old, William Whitmore had coerced him into signing a labor contract. Marcus, being illiterate, was unable to read the contract, and its terms were never explained to him. He later discovered that the contract bound him for an entire year and falsely claimed that he owed Whitmore money for his upkeep. Each year, Whitmore presented Marcus with a new contract, relentlessly claiming that he still owed money for food, housing, clothing, and tools. These amounts were arbitrarily determined and consistently exceeded his meager wages. When Marcus attempted to leave in 1874, at the age of 18, Whitmore had him arrested on fabricated charges of breach of contract and debt. The local sheriff, who was a close friend of Whitmore, apprehended Marcus and returned him to Oakwood in chains. "I was free by law," Marcus testified, "but in reality, I was a prisoner. Mr. Whitmore maintained control over me and others like me through fear. He threatened that if we dared to run, he would hunt us down and have us hanged for theft, knowing full well that no one would believe a colored man over a white landowner." And, tragically, he was right. Marcus recounted years of this oppressive existence, toiling relentlessly from dawn till dusk, never able to save any money, never able to escape the clutches of Whitmore's tyranny. Other workers came and went, but Marcus remained trapped by circumstance and the ever-present threat of Whitmore's retribution. Then, in 1888, a glimmer of hope emerged. Thomas Whitmore, who had been away studying at the University of Virginia, returned home. Thomas and Marcus had grown up together. Though not as equals, their relationship was closer than that of a typical enslaver and enslaved person. Thomas's mother, Elizabeth, had secretly taught both boys to read, defying the social norms of the time. They had even played together as children, before the harsh realities of their differing positions created an insurmountable barrier. Thomas was utterly shocked to find Marcus still at Oakwood, still bound by fraudulent contracts, still deprived of his rightful wages. He immediately launched an investigation into his father's business practices, uncovering the appalling truth. William Whitmore had been operating an illegal peonage system for years, effectively holding Marcus and several other workers in bondage through deceitful contracts and manipulation. Marcus's congressional testimony continued, providing details that brought the photograph into sharp focus. In early 1889, Thomas Whitmore confronted his father about the abhorrent peonage system. According to Marcus's account, the confrontation was explosive. Thomas told his father that his actions were not only illegal but morally reprehensible, Marcus testified. He argued that slavery had ended, and it was time to release me and the others from our forced servitude. Mr. William Whitmore, the elder, simply laughed, dismissing his son's concerns. He brazenly declared that the law was whatever powerful men decided it was, and that no court would ever believe the word of colored workers over his. But Thomas refused to be silenced. He spent months secretly copying his father's business records, meticulously documenting the fraudulent contracts, the ledgers revealing unpaid wages, and the fabricated debts used to keep the workers trapped. He even consulted with a lawyer in Richmond, a man named Robert Petton, who had a history of involvement in civil rights cases. "Thomas approached me in August 1889, Marcus testified. He revealed that he had obtained evidence that could secure my freedom and provide compensation for years of stolen wages. However, he cautioned me that it would be a dangerous undertaking, as his father was a powerful man with influential friends. He warned that if we proceeded with a legal case, there would inevitably be dire consequences." Marcus, despite the inherent risks, urged Thomas to proceed. He firmly believed that freedom, even with its inherent dangers, was infinitely preferable to continued bondage. On September 10, 1889, Thomas bravely filed a counterclaim against his own father, accusing him of maintaining an illegal peonage system and submitting the meticulously copied documents as evidence. William Whitmore was consumed by fury. Marcus testified that his father accused Thomas of betraying his family, tarnishing their name, and siding with colored people over his own blood. But Thomas stood firm, unwavering in his conviction. He declared that his conscience would not allow him to benefit from Marcus's forced labor. 4 days later, on September 14th, Thomas accompanied Marcus to Richmond to have their photograph taken. It was a deliberate and defiant act, Marcus explained, a visual testament to their friendship and Thomas's unwavering commitment to treating Marcus as an equal. The matching suits, the companionable pose, the choice of Anderson and Sons Photography Studio, renowned for photographing Richmond's elite families, all served to make a powerful statement. Thomas wanted the world to know that he stood with me, Marcus declared. He wanted a record that could never be erased or denied. But Marcus also testified about the unseen elements within the photograph, the pervasive fear that haunted them both. Thomas had received menacing threats from his father's associates. Marcus had been warned by other workers that William Whitmore was plotting something sinister. They were acutely aware that powerful men did not relinquish their power easily, and that justice for black workers was exceedingly rare in 1889 Virginia. The inscription on the back of the photograph, "May God forgive us for what we have done," acquired a profound new meaning in light of Marcus's testimony. Thomas understood the consequences of filing a case against his father. He was seeking forgiveness, not for an immoral act, but for the family betrayal that his act of justice necessitated. Marcus's testimony then turned to the tragic circumstances of Thomas's death. His voice, even filtered through the formal language of congressional records, conveyed a palpable grief that resonated across more than a century. On October 2, 1889, I was working in the carpentry shop at Oakwood, Marcus recounted. Thomas had moved into the overseer's cottage to distance himself from his father. That evening, I heard a gunshot coming from the main house. I immediately ran towards the sound and discovered Thomas lying in his father's study. He was covered in blood and barely conscious. He looked at me and whispered, "Run, Marcus." "Papers, desk, run." Marcus testified that William Whitmore arrived mere seconds later, accompanied by the sheriff. They immediately accused Marcus of shooting Thomas, fabricating a charge of attempted murder. Marcus, fearing he would be lynched if he remained, fled into the woods near the plantation. That night, under the cloak of darkness, he cautiously returned to the overseer's cottage. "I located the papers Thomas had mentioned," Marcus testified. "Legal documents signed by a judge, ordering my release from all contracts and awarding me compensation for back wages. Thomas had obtained them that very day. He had secured my freedom on paper, and his father had murdered him for it." Marcus seized the documents and fled, walking at night and hiding during the day, embarking on a perilous journey north through Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. He arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes on his back and the legal papers that confirmed his freedom. "Thomas Whitmore gave his life because he believed I deserved to be free," Marcus solemnly declared to the Congressional Committee. "He relinquished his inheritance, his family, and ultimately his life, because he could not accept that I was still enslaved. I carry that debt with me every single day." James leaned back from his laptop, overwhelmed by the profound weight of Marcus's testimony. The photograph was far more than just a document of friendship. It represented Thomas's final gift to Marcus, tangible proof of their unwavering bond and Thomas's unwavering commitment to justice. The fear evident in both their eyes was not mere paranoia. It was a prescient awareness that their act of defiance would have devastating consequences. Thomas had been murdered by his own father, and William Whitmore had abused his power to conceal the truth, bribing the sheriff, coercing the doctor into signing a false death certificate, and suppressing any investigations by the newspapers. Thomas's supposed accidental shooting was a deliberate act of violence, but Marcus had survived to tell the truth. He had escaped, rebuilt his life, and ultimately found the courage to publicly testify about the horrors that transpired at Oakwood. His testimony before Congress played a crucial role in a larger investigation into peonage, leading to some reforms, although enforcement remained woefully inadequate for decades. James was determined to uncover what happened to Marcus after his testimony, and he desperately wanted to learn if Marcus had any descendants who might still possess the documents Thomas had given him, perhaps even the original photograph. James reached out to the National Archives, requesting any additional documents related to Marcus Freeman's 1902 congressional testimony. While awaiting their response, he continued to trace Marcus's life through Philadelphia records. The 1910 census revealed that Marcus and Sarah Freeman were still residing on South Street, now with 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 13. Marcus's carpentry business had flourished, employing 3 workers and owning the building where his shop was located. His success was truly remarkable, considering he had arrived in Philadelphia penniless just 19 years earlier. James discovered numerous articles about Marcus in the Philadelphia Tribune throughout the 1900s and 1910s. He had become a prominent figure in the city's Black community, serving on the board of the First Baptist Church, advocating for workers' rights, and supporting education initiatives. In 1915, he delivered a powerful speech at the dedication of a new school, emphasizing the importance of education as a tool for liberation. However, it was a 1920 article that provided James with his next significant breakthrough. The Tribune published a feature story highlighting successful Black business owners in Philadelphia, including an extensive profile of Marcus Freeman. The article mentioned that Marcus kept documents from his past in his office, serving as a daily reminder of the cost of freedom. James knew he had to find those documents. If they still existed, they might include Thomas Whitmore's legal papers, letters, and possibly even the original copy of the photograph. He searched for Marcus's death record and found it in the 1935 Philadelphia Vital Records. Marcus Freeman had passed away on July 12, 1935, at the age of 70. His obituary in the Tribune was extensive, detailing his business accomplishments and community service. It mentioned that he was survived by his wife, Sarah, 4 children, and 9 grandchildren. James embarked on the painstaking task of tracing Marcus's descendants. The oldest child, a son named Thomas Freeman, undoubtedly named after Thomas Whitmore, had become a teacher in Philadelphia's public schools. James located records of Thomas Freeman teaching at various schools between 1925 and 1960. The younger son, William Freeman, had relocated to New York and worked as a postal clerk. The 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Dorothy, had both married and remained in Philadelphia. Dorothy Freeman Hayes, the name resonated in James's mind. That was the name on the donation letter. The estate sale in Richmond had originated from Dorothy Hayes, Marcus Freeman's daughter. James retrieved the original donation letter and reread it, now with a newfound understanding. Dorothy Hayes had passed away at the age of 97, indicating that she had been born around 1927, making her Marcus's granddaughter, not his daughter. The letter stated that her home had been filled with historical documents and photographs that had never been fully explained. Marcus's granddaughter had inherited his papers and preserved them for decades without fully grasping their significance. And upon her death, they had ended up in an estate sale, eventually finding their way to James's desk at the museum. He immediately contacted the executor of Dorothy Hayes's estate, a lawyer named Jennifer Park. "Miss Park, this is James Rivera from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You sent us a donation from Dorothy Hayes's estate. I need to inquire whether there were any other items in her home, specifically papers, documents, and photographs that were not included in the donation." Jennifer Park sounded surprised. "Yes, there were several boxes of papers. We donated what we believed to be historically significant. However, there were also boxes of family documents that seemed more personal, such as letters, business records, and legal papers. Those were set aside for possible family members, but we haven't been able to locate any living relatives yet." "Those papers could be incredibly crucial," James exclaimed, his heart pounding with anticipation. They could contain documents related to a major historical case involving peonage and illegal labor practices. Would it be possible for me to examine them? Jennifer readily agreed to meet him at her office in Richmond the following day. James immediately booked a flight and called Patricia to share the momentous news. Dorothy Hayes was Marcus Freeman's granddaughter, he explained, and she possessed his papers, which could potentially include the documents that Thomas Whitmore had died to protect. "This is incredible," Patricia exclaimed. 135 years later, and we're finally on the verge of seeing the evidence that Thomas Whitmore gathered against his own father. That night, James found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of Marcus Freeman's arduous journey to freedom, carrying legal papers that had cost his friend his life. Marcus had safeguarded those documents for decades, passing them down to his children and grandchildren, preserving evidence of both injustice and heroism. And now, through an improbable chain of events, those documents were poised to reveal their long-held secrets. Jennifer Park's office in Richmond was located in a beautifully renovated Victorian building, not far from the former site of Anderson and Sons photography studio. She led James to a storage room where 5 cardboard boxes sat on a table, each labeled with Dorothy Hayes's name. "These are the personal papers," Jennifer explained. "Family letters, some business documents from a carpentry business, which I believe belonged to her grandfather, and various legal papers. I didn't examine them closely, as they appeared to be private family materials." James carefully donned archival gloves and opened the first box. Inside, he found letters neatly sorted into bundles and tied with ribbon. He gently untied one bundle and began to read. They were letters written by Marcus Freeman to his children, dating from 1920 to 1935. The handwriting was elegant and clear, a testament to the literacy that Elizabeth Whitmore had secretly imparted to him as a child. Many of the letters contained advice about business, family, and life. However, one letter, addressed to his son Thomas Freeman in 1929, directly confronted the past. "My son, you bear the name of the bravest man I ever knew. Thomas Whitmore was more than just a friend to me. He was my brother in all but blood, and he gave his life so that I could be free. I have recounted this story to you countless times, but I want you to have it in writing so that you can share it with your children and they can share it with theirs. The truth must not die with me." The letter proceeded to recount the story that Marcus had shared in his congressional testimony, but with more personal and intimate details. Memories of growing up with Thomas, of Elizabeth Whitmore secretly teaching them to read, and of Thomas's profound horror upon discovering that his father was still holding Marcus in illegal bondage. James meticulously photographed each page, then moved on to the second box. This box contained business records from Marcus's carpentry business, including ledgers documenting income and expenses, contracts for building projects, and employee records. Marcus had maintained meticulous records, perhaps as a reflection of the fraudulent records that had once been used to enslave him. The third box held the treasure that James had been seeking. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and the ravages of time, were legal documents from 1889. James's hands trembled as he carefully unfolded them. The first document was a court order, dated October 2nd, 1889, the very day that Thomas had died. It was signed by Judge Robert Chambers of the Richmond Circuit Court, and it ordered the immediate release of Marcus Freeman from all labor contracts with William Whitmore. The document declared the contracts fraudulent and awarded Marcus $500 in back wages, precisely the same amount that had been mentioned in William Whitmore's probate file. The second document was an affidavit signed by Thomas Whitmore, meticulously detailing the evidence he had gathered, copies of the fraudulent contracts, ledgers revealing unpaid wages, and sworn testimonies from other workers who had been trapped in peonage. Thomas's handwriting was confident and clear, his language precise and unwavering. He concluded the affidavit with words that brought tears to James's eyes. "I submit this evidence not as a son betraying his father, but as a citizen upholding the law and as a friend honoring the humanity of Marcus Freeman, who has endured years of illegal bondage at my family's hands. If there is shame to be found in this testimony, it belongs to those who perpetuate such systems, not to those who expose them. I am prepared to accept any consequences that may arise from speaking this truth." James leaned back, completely overwhelmed by the weight of Thomas's sacrifice. Thomas had been fully aware of the risks involved. He had filed these papers knowing that his father might retaliate, and he had done so anyway, because Marcus's freedom was worth more than his own safety. The third document was a copy of the photograph, not the original that James had discovered in the donation, but a second print with a note attached in Thomas's handwriting to Marcus. "This photograph was taken so that no one can ever deny our friendship or question my sincerity in advocating for your freedom. We stand as equals here, as we should stand under the law. If something happens to me, use this evidence to prove the truth. Your friend always, Thomas Whitmore." September 14th, 1889. James photographed everything, his mind racing with the implications. Thomas had anticipated his own death. He had provided Marcus not only with legal documents securing his freedom, but also with irrefutable evidence to expose the truth if William Whitmore attempted to cover it up. The fourth box contained newspaper clippings that Marcus had meticulously saved, articles about peonage, about labor rights, and about the agonizingly slow progress toward justice. And buried amongst them was a brittle newspaper clipping from a Richmond paper, dated November 1912. The headline read, "William Whitmore, prominent planter, dies at 78. Marcus had preserved his enslaver's obituary. James read the article and found it to be the typical laudatory piece, portraying Whitmore as a respected citizen and successful businessman. There was no mention of Thomas's death, no mention of peonage, no hint of the appalling truth. William Whitmore had died with his reputation intact, his crimes unpunished. But Marcus had known, and Marcus had ensured that the evidence survived. The fifth box contained personal items, Marcus's Bible, a pocket watch, and a small leather journal. James carefully opened the journal. It was a diary that Marcus had kept from 1890 to 1900, documenting his new life in Philadelphia. The first entry, dated January 15, 1890, began, "I am free. Thomas died to make it so, and I will not squander the gift he gave me. Today, I begin my life as a truly free man." James read through entries describing Marcus's arrival in Philadelphia, his struggles to find work, his unwavering determination to build something meaningful with his freedom. There were entries about meeting Sarah, about starting his carpentry business, about the birth of his children, and scattered throughout were entries about Thomas. June 12, 1891. Today would have been Thomas's 25th birthday. I think of him often and wonder what he would have become if he had lived. A lawyer, perhaps fighting for justice, or a teacher like his mother. He had a good heart, a rare quality in a world that often rewards cruelty. September 14, 1895. 6 years ago today, Thomas and I had our photograph taken. I look at it sometimes and remember his courage. He knew what his father might do, and he moved forward anyway. I try to live my life in a way that honors his sacrifice. October 6, 1800. 11 years since Thomas died. My son Thomas is learning to read. I teach him every night the way Thomas's mother taught us. I tell him about the man whose name he carries and why courage matters more than comfort. James closed the journal, deeply moved. Marcus had never forgotten. He had carried Thomas's memory for nearly half a century, passing the story down to his children, preserving the evidence, ensuring that both the injustice and the heroism would be remembered. James spent 2 days in Richmond, meticulously documenting every item from Dorothy Hayes's estate. With Jennifer Park's permission and assistance, he arranged for the documents to be professionally preserved and eventually donated to the National Museum, where they would be accessible to researchers and the public. However, James had one more crucial task to complete. He needed to locate living descendants of Marcus Freeman and share the story with them. He also wanted to find descendants of Thomas Whitmore, if any existed, so that they could learn the truth about their ancestors' courage and sacrifice. Patricia assisted him in tracing the Freeman family line. Marcus's son Thomas had 3 children, one of whom, Marcus Freeman II, had become a civil rights lawyer in the 1960s. Marcus, too, had 2 daughters, both of whom were still living. Patricia located contact information for the older daughter, Dr. Alicia Freeman, a retired professor of African American history residing in Oakland, California. James called her, his heart pounding with anticipation. "Dr. Freeman, my name is James Rivera. I'm a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I've been researching your great-great-grandfather, Marcus Freeman, and I've uncovered some remarkable documents about his life and his friendship with a man named Thomas Whitmore." There was a long pause. Then Alicia Freeman responded, her voice thick with emotion. "Thomas Whitmore, I know that name. My grandfather, Marcus Freeman II, told me stories about him when I was a child. He said Thomas Whitmore was the reason our family was free, the reason we existed at all. But we never had proof, never had documents, just stories passed down through generations. "I have the proof," James declared. "I have the legal documents Thomas Whitmore filed to free your great-great-grandfather. I have an affidavit he wrote, a photograph they took together, and your great-great-grandfather's diary describing their friendship and Thomas's sacrifice. Would you like to see them?" Alicia Freeman flew to Washington 3 days later. James met her at the museum with Patricia, and they spent an entire afternoon poring over the documents. Alicia examined each item with the meticulousness of a historian and the profound emotion of a descendant learning her family's complete story for the first time. When she saw the photograph, her great-great-grandfather's young face, the fear in his eyes, but also the strength, standing beside the white man who would die to free him, she wept openly. "We always knew Marcus Freeman was brave," she said. "We knew he escaped and built a life, but I never fully understood how he got free, or what it cost." Thomas Whitmore, she continued, he was just a name in family stories, almost mythical. But this, she gestured at the documents, this makes him real. It makes his sacrifice real. James showed her the letter Thomas had written on the back of the photograph. "If something happens to me, use this evidence to prove the truth." He showed her Marcus's diary entries, decades worth of remembering and honoring Thomas's memory. They loved each other, Alicia stated simply. Not in a romantic way, but as brothers would. The system had attempted to force them into the roles of enslaver and enslaved, respectively, but they refused to accept those roles that were thrust upon them. They insisted on being friends, on being equals, even when it ultimately cost Thomas everything he had. James then broached what could potentially be a sensitive topic. "Dr. Freeman, I'd like to create an exhibition centered around the story about Marcus and Thomas, about peonage, about the immense courage it took to stand up against such profound injustice. Would you and your family be comfortable with that?" "Comfortable?" Alicia laughed, wiping tears from her eyes. "It would be an honor. This story absolutely needs to be told. People need to truly understand that slavery didn't just magically end in 1865. It simply evolved and took on different, more insidious forms." She continued, "And people desperately need to know about individuals like Thomas Whitmore, white people who actually risked their lives for the sake of justice, not just their own personal comfort or their public reputation." Over the following weeks, James collaborated closely with Alicia and other members of the Freeman family to meticulously plan the exhibition. They ultimately decided to title it "The Photograph That Testified," a story of friendship, courage, and the fight against peonage. However, James still felt compelled to locate Thomas Whitmore's descendants. Tracing William Whitmore's lineage proved to be relatively straightforward. He had a daughter from a subsequent marriage who, in turn, had children and grandchildren. But James couldn't help but wonder if those descendants were even aware of the full truth about their ancestor, or if they had simply grown up believing the sanitized version of William Whitmore as a well-respected, upstanding planter. Patricia eventually located a descendant named Robert Whitmore, a retired attorney residing in Alexandria, Virginia. He was William Whitmore's great-great-grandson. James contacted him with caution, unsure of how he might react to learning that his ancestor had, in fact, murdered his own son and engaged in illegal peonage practices. Robert Whitmore agreed to meet with him. When James recounted the entire story, carefully showing him the historical documents, the photograph, and Marcus's compelling testimony, Robert sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke. "My family always said, Thomas died in a hunting accident. We were always told that he was the favorite son, and that his death absolutely devastated my great-great-grandfather. There were vague hints of some kind of conflict between them, but nothing ever specific." He then looked intently at the affidavit, at Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. "This," he said, "this explains absolutely so much. How do you feel about it all?" James asked, choosing his words carefully. Robert met his gaze directly, ashamed that William Whitmore was my ancestor, but incredibly proud that Thomas Whitmore was as well. "I never had the chance to know him, but I'm eternally grateful that he did the right thing, even though it ultimately cost him absolutely everything." And I'm profoundly grateful to Marcus Freeman for diligently preserving Thomas's memory, for ensuring that the unvarnished truth survived. He paused momentarily, then continued, "My family undeniably benefited from wealth that was built upon enslaved labor and illegal peonage practices. That's a difficult and painful truth to face head-on, but pretending it simply didn't happen, or offering excuses for it, would be infinitely worse. I would genuinely like to be a part of telling this story, if you'll allow me to." Thomas Whitmore deserves to be remembered as the remarkable man he truly was, someone who bravely chose justice over familial loyalty, who recognized and honored Marcus Freeman's inherent humanity when so many others deliberately refused to do so. 6 months later, the National Museum of African American History and Culture officially opened, the photograph that testified. The carefully curated exhibition occupied a prominent gallery space, and long lines formed well before the doors even opened on the first day. The undisputed centerpiece was the photograph itself, meticulously displayed at eye level with professional lighting that highlighted every single detail. The stark fear visible in both men's eyes, the tight, almost desperate grip of Thomas's hand, Marcus's tightly clenched fist, and the barely perceptible chain lingering in the background. Alongside it was Thomas's handwritten note, "We stand as equals here, as we should stand under the law." The exhibition comprehensively told the complete and unvarnished story through various documents, personal letters, and contextual information. It thoroughly explained the insidious system of peonage that effectively trapped thousands of black workers long after slavery had been officially abolished. It also displayed copies of the fraudulent contracts that Marcus had been coerced into signing, the court order that ultimately freed him, and Thomas's powerful affidavit against his very own father. One particularly poignant section of the exhibition focused specifically on Thomas Whitmore's momentous decision and the devastating consequences he faced as a result. Visitors could carefully read his affidavit, see copies of the old newspaper reports detailing his accidental death, and gain a profound understanding of the extraordinary courage it took to testify against his own father in 1889 Virginia. The exhibition deliberately didn't present Thomas as some kind of perfect savior figure, but rather as a complex and multifaceted individual who had grown up benefiting from both slavery and peonage, but who ultimately recognized the inherent injustice and chose to act decisively, despite the considerable cost to himself. Another section of the exhibition documented Marcus Freeman's life following his escape, his arduous journey to Philadelphia, his successful carpentry business, his unwavering advocacy work, and his impactful congressional testimony. Visitors could examine pages from his personal diary, letters to his beloved children, and various newspaper articles chronicling his remarkable success. The exhibition effectively demonstrated that freedom, once gained, could lead to truly remarkable achievements. A video played continuously, featuring Alicia Freeman and other descendants sharing cherished family stories about Marcus, explaining how his enduring legacy had profoundly influenced their own lives and reflecting deeply on what it truly meant to know the complete and unvarnished truth about their ancestors' long and challenging path to freedom. Robert Whitmore also participated in the video, thoughtfully acknowledging his ancestors' reprehensible crimes and honoring Thomas Whitmore's extraordinary courage. "Facing difficult family history isn't easy," he stated in the video, "but it's absolutely necessary. We cannot change the actions of our ancestors, but we can certainly choose how we remember them and how we conduct ourselves in our own lives." He concluded, Thomas Whitmore made the right choice back in 1889, even though it cost him absolutely everything. The very least I can do is make sure that his courageous choice is remembered and honored for generations to come. The exhibition also included a section dedicated to the broader context of peonage, illustrating how various systems of debt bondage, convict leasing, and exploitative sharecropping had effectively maintained conditions remarkably similar to slavery for decades following emancipation. It also included compelling testimony from other survivors, relevant legal documents from various peonage cases, and comprehensive information about the slow and frustratingly incomplete progress toward achieving true justice. On opening day, James stood in the bustling gallery, carefully observing visitors as they engaged with the exhibition. He watched intently as people leaned in close to the photograph, studying the faces of Marcus and Thomas with intense focus. He saw them diligently read the historical documents with growing understanding and, often, palpable anger. He also witnessed parents patiently explaining to their children exactly what peonage was and why Thomas's ultimate sacrifice truly mattered. Alicia Freeman stood quietly beside him. "My great-great-grandfather would be so proud," she said softly. He meticulously kept these documents safe for over 40 years, faithfully passing them down to his children, diligently preserving the irrefutable evidence. He desperately wanted people to know the truth. And now, finally, 135 years after that photograph was taken, people are finally listening. A young black woman approached them, tears streaming freely down her face. "Thank you so much for this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never even knew about peonage. I just assumed that slavery had simply ended in 1865, and that was the end of it. But seeing the actual contracts, seeing the insidious ways they managed to trap people, it helps me to understand why true freedom took so much longer than just emancipation." An elderly white man stopped to converse with Robert Whitmore, who was volunteering as a docent for the day. "My family was also from Virginia," the man said thoughtfully. "My grandfather likely knew families just like yours. This exhibition has made me seriously wonder what my own ancestors might have done, what they might have been complicit in. It's undeniably uncomfortable, but incredibly important." Throughout the day, visitors engaged with the exhibition in a deeply meaningful way, taking the time to carefully read every document, watching the video presentations multiple times, and genuinely sitting with the weight of everything they were learning. The photograph that had once seemed to depict a simple friendship had ultimately revealed itself to be a complex and powerful testament to courage, profound injustice, and the enduring bonds that could transcend even the most dehumanizing systems of racism. As the museum staff prepared to close that evening, James walked slowly through the gallery one final time. He paused directly in front of the photograph, gazing intently at the two young men frozen in time. Marcus Freeman, who would ultimately survive to build a truly remarkable life and diligently preserve the unvarnished truth for future generations, and Thomas Whitmore, who would tragically die for the cause of justice just 18 days after this pivotal image was captured. The inscription that Thomas had painstakingly written echoed powerfully in James's mind. "If something happens to me, please use this evidence to definitively prove the truth." Thomas had known deep down that he might very well die. He had meticulously prepared for that very real possibility, ensuring that Marcus would possess the legal proof of his rightful freedom and the irrefutable evidence of what had truly transpired. And Marcus had wholeheartedly honored that sacred trust, carrying the fragile documents hundreds of miles, carefully preserving them through decades of hardship, and faithfully passing them down to his children with the solemn instruction to always remember. The photograph had been meticulously taken as evidence, as undeniable visual testimony that Marcus Freeman and Thomas Whitmore stood as absolute equals, that their genuine friendship was indeed real, and that Thomas's unwavering commitment to justice was entirely genuine. For an incredible 135 years, it had waited patiently in albums and dusty boxes, passed carefully through generations, finally arriving at James's desk through a remarkable chain of circumstances that seemed almost miraculous in nature. Now, the photograph had finally fulfilled its intended purpose. The profound truth it so powerfully documented had been definitively revealed, widely believed, and given the honor and recognition it so richly deserved. Marcus Freeman and Thomas Whitmore, one black, one white, both tragic victims of a deeply flawed system that sought to make them enemies, but who instead resolutely insisted on remaining steadfast friends, had ultimately left behind a remarkable legacy that transcended their own era. Their inspiring story would undoubtedly motivate future generations to choose courage over comfort, justice over blind loyalty to unjust systems, and the fundamental recognition of our shared common humanity over the artificial and divisive constructs of race. The photograph, Once a seemingly innocent image that concealed a dark and painful secret had ultimately transformed into a powerful and enduring symbol of resistance, selfless sacrifice, and the profound possibility of genuine solidarity across racial lines. As visitors slowly filed past the iconic image, seeing it clearly for perhaps the very first time in more than a century, James reflected deeply on all of the countless other photographs patiently waiting to be carefully examined, all of the other compelling stories hidden in plain sight, and all of the other crucial truths that deserve to be diligently uncovered and faithfully honored. The vital work of remembering truthfully, completely, and courageously would most certainly continue.